Thank you for inviting me to come and give you a lecture that's completely different than probably the lectures you've seen before. It's new for me as well. So this is a brief history of Symbiote, which sounds like this is something that's very old and as in the history books. But what the talk was intended to do was talk about not just the technology for solving a really hard problem, but in a relatively short period of time, roughly 5-6 years, a research idea developed into a commercial product and deployed in scale through a two-letter company called HP. That's pretty unusual. In the many years I've been a professor, and I've run into many faculty and students who are entrepreneurial, and this is the age of entrepreneurship in academia. Everyone has to have an impact and start a company. But to get to the actual end game of licensing the technology for broad use, I've never seen this happen. So I just want to be more historical about it and tell you about lots of the bumps along the way and non-academic aspects of that process. So I hope you find it of interest. So there's a lot of folks here doing work on IoT security, and the marketplace is enormous. These are some recent numbers about the size and scale. And IoT is a term that I think it was Cisco in their writings created. We used to call it embedded systems. But the Internet of Things, they had a report suggesting 25, 30 billion IoT devices on the Internet by 2020 or 2019 or so forth. And of course, as you well know, these are from cams that put them up on the top of your driveway, to your garage, to your refrigerator. They're all IoT devices. And what would you think the manufacturers of these low-cost, retail-oriented products, the retailers and vendors, what do you think they would think about the security of these devices? What is the primary functions that they provide? Is some pain point that people will buy in quantity, and you want lots of people to buy it? Price has to be low. Cost of manufacture has to be low. Software is crap that they put in it. It's a very limited function, and security was never contemplated as an important and critical issue. Many embedded systems, however, the SCADA systems, for example, they recognized that a decade ago of how crucial it is to secure these devices because they could have a big impact. So this is the market now, and this is where it all started. What is that? 2010 or so, 2009 or so. And this was the kind of thinking that I had at Columbia in my lab, the IDS Lab, with one of my students, Ang Sui. This is a good part of this work is due to him and his thesis. And just take a look at this picture. These are the kinds of embedded devices that we were looking at. Now you'll see the word hacked in these slides. I don't think the links are still there, but they did link to articles that appeared at that particular time about all these various devices having been hacked. Now, I want you to look at some of these in particular, because this is Fright Night, right? Mm-hmm. So you have Cisco and Avaya phones, which I'm going to tell you some details about shortly. And the speaker versions of those, same thing. And then all the way on the right is the HP printer. I bet some of you have one of these. These are one of these standard desktop laser jets. They're all over the place. They're like roaches. And of course, some medical devices that we don't know the numbers because of HIPAA violation. The two most interesting, the lower right, home Wi-Fi, and also the Cisco routers on the right at the bottom. Now you want to get a little bit frightened. What we studied first was the Cisco router, and determined pretty quickly that it was horrendously protected, easy to inject malware, and allowed for a botnet to be constructed across routers and the routing infrastructure. And if you really want to get nasty, you could break the router, and I mean break. brick it so that you couldn't actually recover it unless you physically went to the router and reloaded the firmware. All possible. So what might happen if a botnet writer who really wanted to rule the world threatened the world with no internet? Do you have any idea what the consequences of that might be? Believe it or not, this has been studied now for years by a number of think tanks and large corporations who have built in protection mechanisms to survive the loss of their energy systems, because that's one of the first things that comes down. The telecommunication systems, gone. Your Netflix is no longer reachable. What do you do if there's no internet in our modern society? So they've studied major power outages and hurricanes and the effects and what happens soon thereafter. And Stone Age comes right back real fast. So this is a really urgent matter. The government is quite well aware of it. And when we started this line of work, we were trying to get the attention of a number of folks to pay attention. There's a couple of other devices on here. The lower left are weaponry. The processors on board, those devices aren't much different than the printer devices. The one that I find most interesting is the third one on the top row. Can you see what that is? That's the Mars rover. No, that's not a big deal, right? It happens to be the same processor that's in the HP printer. So what you can do to the HP printer, you can do to the Mars rover. You can just freeze it on Mars and then lose all of that investment in sending that thing up to the planet together. Science data, all for naught. IoT hacking now is all the rage. If you look at Black Hat and RSA and all of the traditional hacking-oriented conferences, is one after another paper or presentation, hacking ATM machines, hacking cars, hacking batteries, hacking this, hacking that. They're easy to break into. They're easy to inject into. They're easy to attack. And so it's a little cottage industry. And all it does is it creates a fervor by the VC community to invest in the next $1 billion FireEye for protecting these devices. We started in 2009 asking one fundamental question. Well, okay, how big of a problem is it really? How would you test? How would you measure? How would you develop any kind of observation to give insight into the scale and scope of the problem? Because after all, if it's a small problem, who the hell is interested in it? But if it's a larger problem, then we have something to talk about. So what would be a test or a simple experiment that you can do to measure the scale and scope? So we did something really quite easy. We did a scan of the internet looking for vulnerable devices. So we had, I don't remember the exact numbers, but on the order of like 75 or so devices in the database. And so we would make connections to a device on the internet. When it responded, its response was a fingerprint of the kind of device it would be. And then we would look it up in a database and say, okay, it's a Cisco router with a particular model number probably. And what would you want to do? How vulnerable? How would you measure its vulnerability? So let's be trivial. What's the most trivial vulnerability? So you go to the vendor website and you get the administrative password for it in the public. Now, why would vendors publish one password for millions of devices and put it out in the public?
Makes them easier to use.
Number one, again, no mindset about security. Number two, management. So if you're going to manage thousands and thousands of devices, then it's just like the first generation of nuclear weapons that this country produced when Congress figured out that devices could be exploded by any grunt. They had to be protected, so they put passwords on all of the nukes. And what was the first password? 0000000. Had a password, so complied with what Congress wanted, but again, because of the potential for immediate use, everybody had the same single password, and the easiest thing that you can put in to make it go off. Gabish? Same thing. Cable modem, same thing. One password, get access to all the different cable modems. So we simply figured out, fingerprinted, and then attempt to log in. This is a set of different kinds of devices. 1.4 million. Now, this is a very interesting question. So, this also in cybersecurity research, it touches upon policy and law, of course, because there's lots of things governing what people can and cannot do with computer technology. And here's another question for you. So we send to the device a login request with the administrative password, and the device responds with a command prompt. What does that tell you? Well, we have now access to the device. Okay? But according to law, especially in Italy, where I'm told that if they identify us, we could be arrested and jailed because we had unauthorized access to the devices, especially those that were in Italy. So that's the legal question.
Isn't that the case in the US too?
Say again?
Isn't that the case in the US too?
So the question is a matter of law, and law is all about words, and words is all about ambiguity. It has nothing to do with truth. It has to do with how a judge, will, right? So there's no case law on this in particular, but the smart lawyers say, so it's not actually clear that you had access. You had permission to access by virtue of the command prompt coming back. So is that unauthorized access? Italians go, ma sure. In Italy, in the United States, not so sure. So it's the gray area. And this is really interesting. So cybersecurity is a lot deeper than just malware and detecting X, Y, and Z attacks and so forth. Policy issues and law issues are also a crucial component of all of this. For example, here's another question I like posing to computer scientists. The NSA is not allowed to gather data on US persons. That's a legal term, right? But how the hell can they determine if a piece of data that they gather, which happens to be a US person's piece of data, mere fact of determining whether they are allowed to keep it means that they've captured it and it's in a computer memory. Is that legal or not? Because according to the law, you shall not gather data on US persons, but you have to gather the data to know to delete it. Gabish? So, in order for their mission to be accomplished, that's been adjudicated, and indeed, as long as they delete it from memory, it's legal.
But Sal, isn't this one of the real questions in cybersecurity research, okay, is that when are we able to do the research without stepping across that boundary?
Yes, and that's exactly right. That's why policy issues and legal issues are important to understand and be part of the discussion when you're doing cybersecurity research. And I published a paper not just on the legalities, but the ethics as well. And there are carve-outs in law allowing for security research in the DMCA rulings and the regulations. There are carve-outs. There's actually carve-outs as well in intellectual property law. So if you reverse engineer somebody's proprietary software, that's generally illegal, except for the reason of including or integrating security into the product. That's legal. So it's a very complicated territory. All of that's about to change. With the GDPR from Europe, which is going into effect next year, 2018, you should look at it because it's really very stringent. Now, if you are a customer of a commercial entity and you no longer want to be a customer, you have the right to say, delete all my data. And they have to comply. And if there is a breach of your data, you have to let the customer know within 72 hours. And if you don't, the fees, fines levied against you are 4% of your global revenue. So the Europeans are saying, we are really sure about privacy, and we're now going to control the internet. And so you can imagine how large corporations are freaked right now and how they're going to comply. Anyway, that's a whole nother topic, but this is an important result. Lots and lots of available unprotected, insecure, embedded systems on the internet. When we were doing this work, we predicted roughly from the number of Cisco routers what the expectation was that somebody could easily build a botnet. And at that time, Ong had done some calculations, which turned out to be pretty much on par with one that actually was discovered, the Karna botnet, that had about 400K Cisco routers botted. We estimated 500,000 to 600,000, so we were pretty much on target. You probably don't know about Karna, but it was publicized. Anyway, I don't want to keep us to midnight, so I'm going to go my New York style of talking like mad racing. So at this time, we were focused on the router problem because the seriousness of the threat to the internet and to society in general. There are a number of tools, number of folks who are also doing various exploits against the Cisco router. Now, going forward, I'm going to say iOS. It's Cisco iOS. That's the name of the operating system for the Cisco router. It's not the Apple iOS in your pocket. Different operating system entirely. These Cisco routers are everywhere. I'm sure you got probably a couple of hundred in this building alone. So we started looking at the problem saying, well, how the heck, because Ong was the one who was breaching these in reverse engineering and putting in malware, and he had put in a timer to make the thing crash after, pay me ransom or whatever. And I said, Ong, this is great to learn how to break these things, but we got to learn how to fix these things from the breaking. So stop just breaking and let's start talking about fixing and defending them. And so what's lacking in these devices, these are very low-powered devices, very single purpose. This is a router. All it's going to do is route packets. It's not going to play games. It's not going to run web services. It's not going to be a database engine, nothing of that nature. It just routes packages. What does that mean? The intuition here is the firmware of the device is implemented on a general purpose computer, but it shouldn't do anything but run that single firmware and not have any changes to the firmware ever. And so we had the concept together of injecting into the device intrusion detection capabilities, functionality, by rewriting the firmware. And that intrusion detection functionality, I'm going to talk about in more generic terms, we called it initially the parasitic embedded machine. The parasitic embedded machine was extra code that we're going to splice into the firmware by rewriting that firmware or injecting the firmware as if it was malcode itself into safe territory. And that firmware modification hardened the firmware, and the idea was attestation. Continuously attest that the firmware was unchanged. How would you test whether any block of code or any bit string changed by 1 bit? Just checksum it. Continuously checksum it. And if the checksum ever changes, bam, you know that a change was made, you know the router got attacked.
How does that hit performance? If this is a tiny...
I'm glad you asked that.
Oh, good.
So give me about 5-10 more minutes, and the answer is, dang, it doesn't. You have now total control of the performance of the router. I'll show you why. First of all, these are over-provisioned, because you can't predict a priori the rate of packets flowing to the router. So they're always unpredictable. And so I'll show you what we did. That was the idea, but I'm going to say this one more time because this is really important, especially for students. Parasitic embedded machine. Keep that thought. And how the PEM work is very straightforward. And this was done by hand, essentially hooking into the firmware of the Cisco router device essentially a trampoline that allowed us to jump to other code that we added. And that code would do some function and then jump back. So very, very simple hooking into the firmware, not a big deal. Take a breath. All right, so we're doing this work, talking to government. I still have high-level clearances with the government. I'm trying to get everybody scared to death. Of course, Cisco could care less. And so, all right, on routers, nobody even knows what a router looks like, because we showed a couple of our friends in computer science called professors going, you know what that thing is there? Is that a PC? It's a different kind of PC. No, it's a router. They have no idea what a router looks like. Got it. But do you have one of these? A printer. Quick story on Project Gunman. Have you heard of this before, Sean?
No,
Okay, it was declassified in 2011. This is famous in the spy community. And that's the actual device. Now I know there's not that many youngsters here, but the couple that are here, do you know what that device is? It's called a typewriter. And it was two generations earlier than computers and printers. You know what particular device it is? Can you recognize that?
Yeah.
This is how you tell the age of people, if they recognize the...
Like a brother typewriter?
Ah, man, no. That's an IBM Selectric typewriter. Yes. It's the one that had the moving head, the round ball, blah, 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 blah. So the bar at the bottom, the ball would track along a bar, just go back and forth. And as it went, the ball would shift, hit the particular key, would make the head of the print ball hit the paper and so forth. You see the bar at the bottom? The Russians had they went into the US Embassy in Moscow, repaired the IBM typewriter, put in this bar that you'll see has some electronics in it. So every time the typewriter was being used, every key was transmitted to a truck outside, so the Russians were spying on the US Embassy. Fortunately, the counterintelligence folks at that time, who did a spectacular job, discovered it, and they kept it in place. Gabish? So that was our means of poisoning them with deceptive materials by typing all manner of nonsensical, believable. This was the big D word. Tomorrow I'll talk about deception. Until about 10 years ago, you could not use the D word. You could not get a penny of funding for the D word. And now me and a bunch of other folks are trying to build deception security in scale. And a lot of investors are putting money into it. But this is the kind of stuff that the government would do in SAPs, counterintelligence and using deception. This was a perfect tool. Anyway, that's Project Gunman. You can read about it. And this is Project Gunman version 2 in more modern times. So in the case of the Russian implant into the IBM Selectric typewriter in the American embassy in Moscow, you could do the same thing for any HP printer, in this case, the LaserJet. This is the first, that's Ong's finger. And we found a vulnerability in all of these versions of the printer. Here's the vulnerability. Remember what I said earlier about IoT devices? Security what? So here is another design flaw. Again, for ease of use and maintenance and so forth. You buy an HP, and it's just not HP, it's everybody. So HP, I love them, and I'll tell you why when I get finished with the talk. And the history is important to understand. An organization like them I really respect. Cisco, I don't. You got that on tape, right? So you have bought your printer, somebody finds a bug. They make many millions of these printers every quarter, many millions. And you now have to have firmware update to repair the bug. Because especially with the third-party software that they package, it could be a failure and things go bad. how do you update the firmware of a printer? Have you ever done it? So we do open the back of it and then you shove in a little card or something to update the firmware. So I could just see it. Years ago, an engineer at HP said, gosh, you know, we have the firmware update problem out in the field. I have the answer. I know how we do it. How would you update the firmware of a printer? You print the firmware. So they have a firmware update process with special JCL commands so that if you fashion a print job that has these commands, you're printing to the HP printer using a print command, but rather than printing the thing that it just got, it updates the firmware that's part of the print job. That's a update process for scale. So if you wanted to attack printers in scale, where would you look for an opportunity to change the firmware of a device? Capiche? So this was reverse engineered and a flaw was discovered and it was then exploited. So we can now reprint. We could print and reflash the firmware of the HP printer, including a new piece of firmware with a new piece of software of our choosing. And so that's how it was so easy to embed malware into the HP printer. What do you think would happen? So under my principles of ethics, we of course informed Cisco of what we learned about their vulnerabilities, and they went like this. And when HP, the attack was discovered, and we packaged everything. And I didn't do it on purpose. It just happened to be on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, where we sent the HP folks under formal channels. We discovered this flaw. We are not going to publish it or publicize it yet until you have a significant period of time where you can repair that flaw. So when you had a patch and ready to repair, we were going to publish this as our scientific work. And to this day, the CTO of HP still laughs and gets angry at how we ruined his Thanksgiving celebration, because they had to call the high-level management to say, we have a problem. How else do you think HP would have responded? Any thought?
The same as Cisco?
How the hell did these guys break our software? The only way, because we use security, we sign our software with a 16-bit key. So they actually put Columbia on notice, thinking that we had insider information, pierced their proprietary veil, and so they were really angry, and they actually sent a number of high-level execs. We sat in the lab, Ong showed them exactly what he did, and they were completely surprised. How is it possible you could reverse engineer our software? It's cottage industry today. You just go buy IDA Pro and you can reverse engineer just about anything. We teach courses on reverse engineering, but it was pretty new. And so they were not aware of the capabilities of the research community, the hacker community, the cybersecurity community doing this kind of work. And lo and behold, they realized they had a problem. And so they rescinded the letter to, I got called by the dean or the provost's office. It's like, hey dudes, we're doing our work. And so they then decided this is a bad idea to adjudicate this. Instead, let's talk about how you can solve this for us. Getting closer now to the story of how we actually transitioned into practical use. The story goes on. Again, HP is not unique. Every manufacturer and vendor of large-scale numbers of devices. Software is the least important. They have done a lot of work to automate the process. But you think a moment when you have model after model, new features and functions and whatnot. The software is today engineered in an appropriate way and so forth. But again, we do not teach our students from the earliest stages about security and principles of security. And so the idea, for example, of attack surface Do you know if anybody in the undergraduate curriculum here even knows what that means? Who teaches in the undergraduate curriculum?
Yeah, we talked about that. So they know.
In the undergraduate?
Yeah.
That's because you got a big fat gift to teach this stuff. Ask your software engineering colleagues to include security into their very hard thing to do. But the point of this is if you look inside the cover, under the covers, you see library 1, library 2, library 3. When they have a new set of functions or features, a firmware update and whatnot, old libraries, why bother taking it out? They're just add another bunch of code. And so all of a sudden you have all this dead code accumulating from prior versions that are all ready to be exploited in an attack, and it's part of the attack surface. All you have to do is find them in memory and then go and exploit them. Oh, better yet, when you find them in memory, you go to the CVE database and look up the exploits, which are in the CVE for you, so you don't have to do any work. You just reverse engineer, thank you, IDA Pro, go get the exploit you want, and you're done. Gavish? You think this is unique? The legacy embedded system, legacy IoT device security problem is huge, and they're all out there waiting to be exploited. Just some more statistics. This is just a collection of libraries and known CVE entries and so forth. So again, ethical reporting. So Ong is Ong. And one of the things we talked about, because we want to get people's attention, could you imagine how frustrating it is knowing this is like a really serious problem and you're the lone, the boy in the woods, and nobody's paying attention to you? So how can we get people's attention? So I said, the printer was, let's do the printer because everyone has one. Every house has one, and it's sitting right next to everyone. And so what's the best thing to get somebody's attention? What if the printer burst into flames? Would that get their attention? It's got a heating element, right? So let's just heat the damn thing continuously and then burn paper and let it burst into flames. So that's what we tried to do. And it failed. Why would it fail? Oh, damn, they thought of that. You know that UL label? UL forces you to do things to protect. When anything heats up, it's got to have a switch, melting junctions, cutting power so that it doesn't overheat. And so they put a thermal switch into every printer, of course, with a cutoff. Wait a second, what's the temperature at which paper burns? 451. Man, you do read. That's great. I asked that of all the undergraduates, and they go, oh. Except the Columbia College students. Core curriculum. 400 degrees cuts the power, but it's good enough to brown the paper. So, talked to, he was really good. Bob Sullivan was a great reporter. He's no longer there. He went off somewhere else, I don't know. And so he wrote the first article, and it went viral. His article was picked up by legitimate other outlets, and friggin' Gawker, is that caught on tape? Gawker, you suck. They wouldn't let the truth get in the way of a great story, so they said, Columbia researchers burn printers, and then it went viral worldwide, even in Russia. I mean, literally hundreds of articles appeared about burning printers. Do you have any recollection of it? This is now 2011, 2012 or so, right? It's about 5 years. Do you still remember it? Yeah. Moving on. So here is, at that time, is getting a little bit more confident because now SCADA systems, and I think it was the SRI folks did this great video of injecting malcode into a SCADA system, which then made a pump continuously operate, and then it burned up and it smoked. And so they prepared that for the government, and then it went out into the public. I think you can still find it. I'm pretty sure it was SRI who did that. So this is good, because now embedded systems in the SCADA and the energy systems industrial systems, water supply, pumping stations, blah, blah, blah. They can easily be attacked because guess what? I mean, the devices are just as insecure. And so there was some article on where it appeared that was, oh, I don't remember, that some water pumping system was attacked by some kid. And this was the picture that they used in the article. And these are cyber warriors who are defending the water supply, you know, that sort of thing. And it was funny because look over the shoulder, and so they're protecting the control systems and the PCs and the servers, but there's a telephone over there. Guess what? Just like the printer, the phone is on the network too, and it's completely ignored. And guess what a phone is? What is that phone? It's a computer, a general purpose computer that just happens to be in a plastic container that makes it a phone. Now, again, old timers here, I hate this stuff, but a long, long time ago, you used to get these square boxes. They had some nice curves to it every once in a while. It came in colors like yellow and black and red. And they had this round thing on the front of it that had 10 holes. You put your finger in one of the holes, and then you turn the round thing until you hit a stopper and let go, and it goes ch-ch-ch-ch. That was called a POTS, plain old telephone service, and obviously replaced with digital telephone technology. But why should we go back to POTS? Yes. Why? Well, it had this property. It was an electrical device with relays. You had a handset that you put to your ear, just like modern ones, but they're more sleek today and prettier. But when you put it on the cradle, there was a switch. The cradle would just latch down and cut the power to the telephone. So power only reached the phone when you take it off cradle, and then the connection's made to the switching center. Capiche? That's a computer. When you put the handset on the cradle, all you're doing is pushing a switch, GPIO pin, that tells the CPU, I'm on cradle, but the computer's continuing to run. Do you get my point? So it's continuously on. It's a general purpose computer on the network without an IDS, no firewall on it, nothing to protect it. You may have encrypted traffic from the device to the SIP server or the SIP client. Great, there's the security. But the damn device is a general purpose computer running a general purpose operating system. And so what are you going to do? Let's go and look at that operating system and see if we can exploit it in some fashion. Another IoT device without security in mind. Oops. I really do love Cisco. I really do, because they make life interesting. So for that particular device, Cisco says, yeah, this is a protected, secure device. It's got all of these security features. So no problemo. Everything's cool. 202 pages. Let's talk a little bit more about it. So this is called the CNU. This is the Cisco Unified Phone version of Unix kind of thing. And it was written by some company that they purchased, a decade earlier. And we searched around. This was interesting. Ong finds a hunk of software on the internet in Russia to reverse engineer the Cisco phone software. So we didn't have to do very much to see the software. It was up on the internet for a relatively short period of time. Somehow it just disappeared. Why would you think it disappeared? I have one theory. There's probably others. The Russian government said, take that down because we can use that. Because guess who uses this phone? This phone comes in black, charcoal gray, and red. So in order to exploit it, this was the sequence events that we did. The device, we wanted to explore what kernel functions were operating, what were implemented, and whether any of them could be used for exploitation for us to inject arbitrary malcode into the device. And so we just did a simple fuzzer and then just iterate and record for every system call with a particular value, what's the behavior of the system call. And expecting it would take maybe, I don't know, a few weeks or so to find a system call that would crash and, have to run through a whole, long list of values. It's like, you gotta be kidding me. So that's the whole list. The red and the green are the system calls that are implemented on that CNU-based Unix phone.
Sorry, what are the green and the white? What are the green and the white?
The white ones are unimplemented. The green and the red are implemented. The greens didn't crash. The reds crashed. Take your pick. Are you kidding me? Thank you, Ang. Here is the other problem. So now what do you want to do, the consequences of this? What can you do with a phone? All right, so you have a phone in your office sitting next to you, and if we could attack it over the network, inject malcode, and have that malcode do whatever we want, the most obvious thing is to listen to your conversations, your farts, and any kind of nasty stuff you said about your colleagues, have fights with somebody. All of the kinds of personal, private things that you do in your own little enclave, whether it's your home, your office, wherever, and we can listen to it over the internet. Would that be bad? Another scary consequence. So we need to use the speaker phone, the speaker microphone on the front of the device. But the way it's implemented, it's essentially, if that microphone is on, is an integrated LED and the light's on. So you'll know. So you want to be stealthy about this. So there's another microphone, and that's the microphone on the handset. Remember what I said before? When you put the handset on, you still got power. So we can turn it on and listen to the handset while it's on the cradle, which we did. Kavish?
Was that enough?
Yes, amazingly so. So Ang had to have fun with this. He did two things. One, he piped all of the audio through Google Text-to-Speech and tweeted it. So you have this listening post sitting in a room, and as I'm talking to you right now, the tweets are going out with the text-to-speech via Google. That's pretty nasty. So if you infect, I don't know, some very important CEO or some important president of some country or whatever, and their tweets now are being done for them, that would be pretty awesome, hey? The other was the Fontana, which is a whole nother talk. Ang is kind of one of the more interesting people I know. This was essentially turning any device, any embedded device or IoT device into an RF broadcast station. So to do that, there's a number of ways you can do it. Again, you need to load malcode and then generate signals that somehow you're going to broadcast, so you need an antenna. And if you look at a phone, for example, the LEDs have these long leads, 6 inches or so, perfect antennas. And so you could then turn the phone into a broadcast device so that you don't have to hear it over the internet if there's any kind of blocking on the network for outbound traffic. It's okay, you can listen to the RF broadcast from the phone also. But then there are other devices that you could turn into RF broadcasting. He called that the Fontana and did a whole bunch of experiments in how far away you can be to pick up the signal and so forth. and it's not hard to do.
Even without SDR.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so you have to do all the processing on board, generate the signals, and then you need a way to essentially broadcast it. So where's the antenna? Well, lots and lots of devices have UARTs. If you overclock the UART, you essentially can generate an RF signal. Isn't that weird? Funtenna. All right, are you scared enough? All the Cisco phones. Cisco's response. I really do love Cisco. Eventually you'll get it. But their phones were vulnerable to these kinds of attacks, can't rewrite the software because the company that we bought that wrote the software, they're all dead. And we don't have the source code, and it's too hard, and all these devices out there, we've got to update. So here, you know what we're going to do? We're going to shove epoxy into the USB port. Years ago, the DoD ordered, thou shalt not put thumb drives into DoD endpoints ever again. So what do? They actually literally had grunts going around shoving epoxy into the USB ports. That's essentially what they did here too. We're just going to disable any commands that you can give to the device. And there you are. And then we got another wave of press about this as well. And of course, Cisco's not alone. Avaya, boof, Avaya, the same thing. Why are they not taking up this problem and the solution that we're now going to start talking about? We're broadcasting it over RSA. And so everybody should be like scared bejeebies. All right, so we're doing all this because we're trying to show you the scale and scope and the importance of the problem and its consequences. But the reason for doing this is to defend these systems, all right? Because we're researchers, we have ethics, and we are cybersecurity. We want impact, we want to protect our infrastructures and our systems and our mothers and fathers and children and all that sort of stuff. And so the defense is the important part. Remember earlier I said about the PEM, the parasitic embedded machine. That's the key to the solution. If we can inject intrusion detection functionality into the firmware of the device, then even legacy devices could be protected. Getting to answer your question soon. But these are very low-powered devices. So imagine compiling semantic endpoint and running it on a Cisco IP phone. No way. No. And worse, I mean, that generation of IDS is all signature-based. So you're going to have signatures being downloaded to your phone every Tuesday night? No way. So it has to be essentially standalone technology for intrusion detection that operates on legacy as well as new devices. So it raises the bar. And this was the intuition that I said earlier. Because all these devices are running general purpose computers, they are special purpose devices. The firmware delivers that functionality. The firmware should never change. And so that's where the notion of attestation came from. At this time, the kind of work that we were doing, and we were supported by DARPA and DHS and others, there were a number of different ideas in the security community. This is probably old hat. Defensive mutualism. This is the concept that we had created of the symbiote. Remember I said parasitic embedded machine? Now all of a sudden symbiote. Did I get to the true story? Okay. And also, almost there. So this, especially for the students, this is another important lesson here. Defensive polymorphism. Well, polymorphism was invented by virus writers to thwart signature-based detection methods. There's a paper that I wrote with one of my students, Ying Bo, on the fallacy about signature and how infeasible it is. And it's been realized polymorphism killed the signature business. So then we were trying to make the case for why anomaly detection was completely necessary. Defensive autonomy. Remember I was talking about the concept of attack surface? Is needless attack surface opportunities. Get rid of as much of the attack surface as you can. Easiest, get rid of dead code. And that helps. Doesn't solve, but helps. So these were the concepts, and these were all embedded in the symbiote concept. And it had to be done agnostic to the device, to the operating system, the platform. And that's a very hard thing to do. But now once you get the basic idea, this is how it would work for any particular platform device firmware. By embedding the parasitic embedded machine in the firmware, and think of it as being embedded in a random fashion so that the rewritten firmware now is distinct per unit. You now have polymorphism that's being applied to the protected device. What you learn, there's much more detail to it. What you learn about one device, you go and buy the Cisco phone that has a Symbiote in it, you reverse engineer it, and you see all this stuff, that's great. You now can attack the device that you own, but what you've learned from that device will not help you attack any other device, because every device is distinct, like this. Same function, different code. So here's for the students. This is, I think, a pretty good idea. I was very proud of it. Twice submitted to the top security conferences, twice rejected for one or another crazy reason. Here is the craziest reason of all. For the first time, I had no choice, but I took the review, sent it to the PC chair who I knew, and I said, you gotta be effing kidding me that you allowed this review. The reviewer said, this problem is solved. This is a complete waste of time. Problem solved with TPMs. Do you agree? So what are you going to do for the gazillions of legacy embedded devices that are all over the place that don't have TPMs? By the way, why isn't this problem solved today? Because everything now it's manufactured as the TPM on board, but why the hell do they use it? Why does everybody use it? You have any idea? Because of pennies. Because the licensing terms, if you actually use the TPM board, you have to pay a license fee, even if it's a couple of pennies. It's too much. The margins are so thin, they're not going to pay a couple of 100 basis points on a retail device. So anyway, you, an academic security expert reviewer, wrote one of the most bonehead reviews. And I sent it to PC chair and said, you guys are nuts for accepting this kind of review. Because he obviously had no depth of knowledge about this problem and why this solution was a pretty good damn solution. And then, bam, the light went off. I get it. Man, parasite. Parasite is like a really negative thing. Parasite you associate with jungles. Like you come back from the jungles of the Amazon and you got all kinds of sores and whatnot from parasites that have fed on you. It's negative, it's nasty, it's disgusting. It's a symbiote that's positive. It's friendly and warm and huggable. Symbiote is a symbiotic relationship between two entities that give benefit to each other together that they don't get when they're separate. The symbiote injected gets CPU cycles. In return, it gets protection to the device. So we renamed it Symbiotic Embedded Machines, and it was proposed for Best Paper Award. Gabish, careful how you message. Parasite is also confusing with parasitic circuits. When you have essentially a short, you get one component that might be a parasitic sucking of power from another. So negative all around, stupid me. I should have said symbiote from the beginning. Anyway, important for your messaging when you write your stuff. The symbiote, this is another view of it, but another thing I got to point out, because again, for cybersecurity research, you got to know how to break these things in order to know how to fix them. There's an inherent duality, the plus and the negative, the north and the south, the good and the bad, the yin and the yang. I have payload, symbiote payload written down there. This is any code we wish to embed in the firmware. We choose to embed intrusion detection payloads to protect the device. Gabish? The duality? Not good, or good, mostly good. I'm now going to go zip through this. So the first thing I had mentioned early on about the parasitic embedded machine POC, a lot of work was done afterwards, including looking through memory, looking for gaps, because we want to embed the PEM, the SEM, the symbiote and all the software associated with it. So we need dead space, unused territory. There's lots of ways of doing that to remove dead code. There's some old algorithms from Targin from the 1970s. All this is all part of standard software engineering, compiler technology, compiler techniques. And the most significant is the payload size for the protection and the IDS attestations, just 336 bytes, so it can fit into a Cisco router without any trouble. Almost there, Sean. This is just a view of what it looks like when you do a view of a symbiote protected firmware. The symbiote's at the bottom. That little thing on the right, that's the extra software that's in it. There. Small compared to the rest of the stuff that's there. And lots of tests were done, 100 millisecond detection rate, which is pretty good. And that varies depending upon this. Here's your answer. So if you look, I don't have the other chart, but if you look at a CPU usage of a router, it looks like white noise uniform distribution because you don't know the packet rate. And so it gets busy when there's a packet storm and then when it drops off. And so the CPU is constantly fluctuating. Here, the CPU on the right are all flat. And that's a chart showing the amount of cycles you give the symbiote payload versus the latency of detection. And so there's a locality principle at play. You cannot predict the packet flows at any moment in time, but you can take the view that it's likely the packet flow in the next unit of time is going to be pretty close to the prior. So this locality principle of I'm going to give the symbiote a certain amount of cycles based upon the previous cycle. If that previous cycle, the CPU usage starts going up, we then give less CPU to the symbiote. So it's an inverse adaptive scheduling, just based upon recent past. It's a heuristic. It works damn good. You still get little bumps in there, but they're insignificant. Now, why are there multiple layers? Well, you choose your latency. You want to know 100 milliseconds, 50 milliseconds, 250. And depending upon the latency, that's how much CPU that you're going to allocate to the symbiote, and that now is going to change the CPU utilization. Now, I said earlier, the routers are typically over-provisioned to deal with spikes. Otherwise, it starts dropping packets, and that's a no-no. So whatever provision has been provided, we were going to use as much of that as you want. And so you get flat CPU, consistent performance out of the CPU, and then the symbiote will detect more or less fast, depending upon how much you feed it. Gabish? Isn't that cool? I think it's a really great idea. I'm really kind of jazzed by that. There's an example of an ordinary packet without the inverse adaptive scheduler, and then with the inverse adaptive scheduler, you get pretty damn good performance. Could you imagine conveying all this to HP? Oh, I haven't finished. This is another whole story on what we also built into this technology, something else. Some time ago, I was curious about the question of one of the areas of work that my students are working on is self-defending defenses. I mean, if you were really good at breaking down walls, you're going to be really good at shutting off the fire alarms first. So how can you attack security defenses, the security software itself? By the way, look at CVE and look at all of the Symantec and McAfee, and just most recently Palo Alto Networks. They update their software. You have live update, there's a reason why. It's just bloated software with its own attack surface, and that's one of the first things that modern malware writers will do, is first try to turn off the IDS, so you go unnoticed. So how can you protect security software from hurting itself and what it's supposed to protect? So the notion of self-defending defenses. And so this was the concept of what the idea I had was if I can embed a whole bunch of monitors into a system and they are randomly connected so that you don't know a priori what they're each looking at, but they're looking at each other. So every monitor is looking at some other monitor. And so if you attack one monitor to shut it down, somebody's going to notice it. That was the general idea. And I go, geez, that sounds very familiar. And I said, so there has to be a technology somewhere that this is a dual again. It's already more than an hour. I hope I'm like not overstaying my welcome. I'm almost done. I'll try really fast. But the idea was, what device do you know of that you don't want turned on? Here we want a device which you don't want to turn off. So if I can find something that you provide a means of defending that you can't turn on, you're done. Lo and behold, Steve Belvin says, you should look at Sandia's website because there's an old technology that the physicists created, which is their version of a TPM called StrongLink, and that's what protects nuclear weapons. So I told you about the first nuclear weapons, they all had a 000 passcode. Every nuclear weapon that is constructed has its own unique code that the physics of the StrongLink device produces, and that's the only thing that could bridge the power gap and allow the weapon to discharge, blow up. The United States gave that technology to the Russians so that they didn't, get, accidentally blow themselves up, or us. So this is now common knowledge. So I read the two papers and I said, all right, so random graph, put a random graph into the software. Boot up, you essentially have an arbitrary random graph, unique and distinct, so you can't predict the monitors monitoring who else. So you have to know the precise sequence of monitors to shut down any particular defense. So the same thing as StrongLink. So that was the self-monitoring monitors, which is also part of the Symbiote technology. There's also binary structure randomization. We changed the, like I was talking about polymorphism, where we also restructured. It's not address, it's essentially address layout randomization at the basic block level. So a lot of techniques were used so that you're left with a device that's distinguished from every other device but provides exactly the same function and has the IDS protection. And the embedded attestation software is unique to that device. That's the Symbiote technology. The response was lots and lots of funding, lots of development, and then a push by DARPA to commercialize this. They gave me $250,000 at Columbia to do tech transfer, and so RBS was born. DHS interest was they did take the Cisco router problem seriously, and so we had a project to turn the internet's legacy routers into a monitoring infrastructure for attacks against the routing infrastructure. So by placing you can't go into every router and update it for a large number of reasons, like you can't shut it down, right? But what you can do is put a Symbiote protected router in the same network that's being routed, and it will catch attacks as well, and that will be the way to alert if you're under an attack in the network. And that led to a project with one of the services of the DoD. I'm finished. You cannot do this without automation, but I want to show you this really cool thing. FRAC was the firmware reverse analysis console, because all of this has to be automated. It was automated, obviously, through a complex piece of software, which is now part of the product offering of RBS. This is how it works. You have a device, doesn't matter what it is. You have to unpack the firmware of that device. It's always best to work with the manufacturer, so you don't have to work so hard here. So if you want to license it, we don't have to do this step. But of course, not all cases, because sometimes they don't have the software from a third party that went out of business. The firmware is unpacked, analyzed. So now you're going to make your choice of taking the Symbiote. You're going to split it up in a random fashion. You're going to inject it into various places, repack the firmware, and shove it onto the device. And now you have a Symbiote protected device. This now has to be incorporated in the manufacturing process or in the update process. Whenever there's a point of firmware being deployed, this is where you want FRAC to do the work for you. And it's there, that's its workflow. Red Balloon spun out of the lab It's been in operation several years, and we announced not too long ago, HP licensed the software. And so we had, took 4.5 years. 4.5 years from the time that they came to the lab, scaring us with lawsuits, to the time that we jointly announced that for this line of HP printers at that time, every one of them has symbiote protection. Pretty damn cool. 4.5 years is, for somebody my age, like that. For a youngster, 4.5 years is like an eternity, but negotiating a deal with a large company is not trivial. But the point I want to make about HP, why I love them so much, they have a tradition of innovation, and they are always forward-thinking. I'm really impressed with them as people, and it was really remarkable that we accomplished that goal. One of the terms that I came up with, messaging, I refer to the HP printer with the Symbiote as the world's most secure printer. You may not have seen it, on buses in Manhattan, lots of online stuff. HP has now a major marketing effort called the world's most secure printing. Thank you. And the reason why this is so important is we were able to cut a deal with HP because the printer business is sort of flat. Everybody produces the same kind of device. They used to compete on quality, we were all the same quality, speed of boot up, same speed, number of pages per minute, same thing. So it flattened. So how do you distinguish yourself? Marketing, image, great commercials, right? Or cutting deals and discounting and whatnot. So, bam. Who is the only one with secure printers? All right, it's another marketing opportunity. The marketing people at HP said, go for it, because then everybody else doesn't have security. We do, and so we're going to corner the market on financial institutions and government agencies, and sure enough. So, messaging. And after all these years, this is just released in August, the friggin' FBI catches up with printer vulnerabilities. Could you believe this? Is that not insane? Oh God, 10 years. Hello? I love our government. A lot of news on the Symbiote technology, and a lot of articles, and it won the Popular Science Best of, and that's Ong. He's the CEO, chairman of the board of, it's his baby, he's running Red Balloon, and doing very, very well. Oh yeah, Avaya finally caught around to doing something too. And just a shout out, one of our papers with my other student, Adrian, this is another whole story, but the quick view is all modern phones, what's the most important commodity is the battery and power. And so they spend a lot of energy, pun intended, to manage power consumption. So there's lots of software in there to power down everything that you can, depending upon the use of the device, blah, blah, blah. So, okay, think a moment. Software controlling the power and battery, the CPU. Attack that software, and now you can play games. And so what Adrian accomplished was he broke TPM by essentially attacking the energy management software, running the CPU beyond the prescribed limits, creating glitches that were able to flip bits during the computation of the key generation process in the TPM, read the keys out. We took 3-4 weeks to give Qualcomm the time to object, but they came back and gave him a $15,000 bounty. It's not repairable. They had to announce it because all the Google phones suffer the consequence of this. And next generation Qualcomm chips, and there's others, won't have this stupidity. No insult, But you shouldn't have made the energy management software exposed, because obviously it's an opportunity. And that won't happen in the future. But be it as it may, it won the Best Paper Award at Unix Security too, so that was pretty cool. So that's Adrian, and that's called Clock Screw, and I encourage you to take a look at it. And they're looking at possible defenses, but it's pretty impossible to repair it, so every new future version of the chipsets will not have that problem. Anyway, thanks very much. That was the Symbiote technology brief history, because it was just the past few years or so, I know, but it was a pretty wild ride from idea to, you can buy it at Amazon.com. So, thank you. And tomorrow I'm going to talk about how to deceive you.
Sal, thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay.